Okay, we're going to see if my voice holds out to talk about local potentials and action potentials. So, a local potential, it's the initial change in membrane potential, and it spreads passively only a short distance, like 1 to 2 millimeters. It can be the jump start for an action potential. So, you could get a lot of little local potentials, and it might be a few millivolts here and a few millivolts there. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom in letter A, the little black arrow indicates a local potential. So we're getting a signal from an axon that's synapsing on the soma of that cell. It changes the charge just in that one little local area of the cell. Here we are at minus 70 millivolts, and we get this little blip. Doop! Tiny little blip, a tiny little depolarization. But it's not enough of a depolarization to generate an action potential that is then going to propagate down the cell. It's little, but it's not enough to actually fire the neuron. So the receptor potentials are generated at an end receptor of a sensory neuron, like a muscle spindle or a Merkel disc, or the ends of those sensory neurons that are out there in the periphery. So the stimulus is a modality like pressure or heat or cold, and that generates that receptor potential. You can also have a synaptic potential, which is generated at the postsynaptic membrane, and that's generated by activating those ligand-gated channels. And so, like a motor neuron or interneurons, they're getting information from other neurons, and that's starting to generate those little local potentials. So how do we add up enough local potentials to then generate an action potential, something that's actually going to do something? So there are two different types of summation. And of course, summation means adding things together. It's a cumulative effect. So with temporal summation, it's in the little diagram here, it shows the little black arrows. Each one of those is a receptor potential, or a synaptic potential, but each one of those is a little nerve impulse. And in the first one, in letter A, one little impulse comes in, it depolarizes the cell the teensiest little bit, but it doesn't have a major effect on it. In letter C, you get one right after another. So each one of those little black arrows represents an impulse, a nerve impulse coming down. So when they're right after another like that, they add up, and so we see we got more depolarization of the cell. So that's adding up. That might get to be enough to be an action potential. It depolarizes the cell a lot more than it did in that letter A, that little blip. Okay, another thing, so that's temporal summation. So a series of receptor or synaptic potentials that occur within milliseconds of each other, they add up and create more depolarization in that local area. Spatial summation is where you get receptor or synaptic potentials generated in different regions of the neuron that all add together. So with the temporal summation, we're getting a lot of different potentials within milliseconds of each other from the same neuron. With the spatial summation, we're getting them from a bunch of different neurons all over our target cell. And those all add up. You can see that also depolarizes the cell. It's less negative than 70 millivolts, and the spatial add up and the temporal add up. So those are the summation. That's how we're going to generate enough local potential to depolarize the cell enough to create an action potential. So there's some videos about temporal and spatial summation, but we're going to go on and talk about action potentials a little bit and threshold level. So action potentials as opposed to local potentials, action potentials are much larger changes in electrical potential. They involve a brief, large depolarization that can be repeatedly generated along the length of the axon. They spread longer distance, and they are actively and passively propagated. So the local potentials, they just spread passively, and they only spread short distances. The action potentials can spread actively and passively, and they spread for much longer distances. So threshold level is usually, it means the sufficient level of depolarization to generate an action potential. So generally in a neuron, it is about 15 millivolts. So if you can depolarize it from minus 70 millivolts to 55 millivolts, that is usually sufficient to generate an action potential that is then going to be propagated down the axon. So there's this little diagram here, and it's from the book. And let me get to where it is. It's figure 2.6, and it is so tiny on here. I really think it would be a good idea to break out your book and look at that up close so you can actually see it. What a concept. It's a great little sequence of events, though. If you follow it from the top, that is your receptor potential, and it happens, the stimulus that happens to open those modality-gated channels, it's deformation of the receptor membrane. So that's a Merkel disc or something that is going at the end of a sensory neuron that's going to react to pressure. You apply pressure and it deforms the membrane, it opens those modality-gated channels, and it generates that receptor potential. It's a local potential. If enough of those add up, if you get enough pressure, if somebody touched you so lightly that you couldn't feel it, it would create a local potential. But if they touched you a little bit harder so you can feel it, that's going to generate the action potential. So that action potential is propagated down the dendrite, down the axon to the presynaptic membrane. At the presynaptic membrane, it releases neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter diffuses across the synapse. It stimulates those ligand-gated channels, those receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and it creates a synaptic potential, opens ion channels to create that synaptic potential. If there are enough of them, it's going to generate an action potential to propagate that down that neuron, and then you will repeat the process all the way down the chain until you finally feel it. And you feel it when that sensory information gets to your brain, and your brain processes it and says, hey, somebody's poking me, or somebody's massaging me, or somebody's putting a heat pack on me. So you actually have to generate enough of an action potential to propagate that down the line in order to get to the point where your brain can process it. Okay, so local potentials are either receptor potentials or synaptic potentials. Receptor potentials are generated at a peripheral receptor of a sensory neuron. Synaptic potentials are generated at the postsynaptic membrane by the binding of neurotransmitter. Local potentials only spread passively, and they're confined to a small area of the membrane. Of course, I'm repeating this now, but I'm repeating it because it's important. Okay? So the peripheral receptors, the end of our sensory receptors, this is our how we communicate with the outside world, they all have modality-gated channels. So when those peripheral receptors are stretched, compressed, deformed, or exposed to thermal or chemical agents, you generate those receptor potentials. So they're generated in motor neurons and interneurons when they are stimulated by input from other neurons. So sensory neurons, they get the information from the outside. Motor neurons and interneurons, they get the information from other neurons. Okay? So we could probably guess that those sensory neurons are afferent neurons going from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. and motor neurons are efferent neurons. Interneurons could actually be either, because they're in between the two, so they could be going in either direction. But all that information ties in. So I'm not going to go through temporal and spatial summation anymore, but you have to. The point is the strength has to be increased enough to generate that threshold amount, that action potential, so then the neuron will fire and it will propagate that signal down the length of the neuron. Okay, so the action potential is a large depolarizing signal that's actively propagated by a repeated generation of the signal. So it keeps doing it until the neuron fires. The information is transmitted longer distance than that just small receptor or synaptic potential. So big deal, right? It's a neuron signal. What does that mean? I mean, the meaning of the signal is determined by which pathway it is running in. So if it's running down our sciatic nerve, it's going to stimulate those, it's an efferent neuron and it's coming from the cerebral cortex and it's running down the sciatic nerve. It's going to stimulate the motor neurons that are going to the muscles in the back of our leg, right? If it's an afferent neuron and it's going from the sensory neurons in the back of your knee, maybe it's telling you that you're sitting on a chair that's too hard and it's going the other way. So the meaning of the signal is determined by the neural pathway. All these signals happen in all the things, but they don't mean anything until you look at the larger system. If that makes sense. So we talk about the action potential as being all or none, meaning either the neuron fires or it doesn't. So every time you have a sufficient stimulus to create a threshold, to reach that threshold, an action potential is generated. Stronger stimuli produce action potentials just as much as minimally sufficient stimuli. So whether you hear a tiny little noise and you say, "What was that?" or you hear a big loud crash, it uses the same pathway and the same action potential. It's just interpreted. There might be more. The stimulus might last longer with a big loud crash, or might generate more action potentials than with a small tiny noise. But you get the same voltage and the same duration as a minimally sufficient stimulus. So kind of interesting. The action potential, you get rapid depolarization of those voltage-gated sodium channels. You get the sodium channels then slam closed, and you get rapid repolarization. And it opens the voltage-gated potassium channels. So it's a really fast sequence of events. Bam! The sodium channels open. They slam shut. And then potassium channels open. So there's a little graphic. I love this graphic, actually. So the threshold stimulus is a stimulus with intensity sufficient to produce an action potential. And I said earlier that it's about 15 millivolts of depolarization. So a change in the membrane potential from -70 to -55, that's typically sufficient to trigger an action potential. So in this diagram, which is figure 2.8 from your book, and there's an animated link in the Canvas classroom that shows this as well. And I really like the superimposing the graph on the membrane channels opening. So when you look at that first one, A, you're at resting potential. And I'm turning to that page in my book too because I can't actually read that. It's so tiny. But so it's on page 34 in the book. At the resting potential, the potassium channels and the voltage-gated sodium channels are both closed. So the sodium's outside the cell, the potassium's inside the cell. Those little purple blobs are those big fat anions that don't fit through. The little blue blobs are chloride. when a threshold potential is reached, the voltage-gated sodium channels open, and sodium starts to move into the cell, going in the direction of its chemical gradient. And that starts to depolarize the axon because the inside becomes less negative. It's depolarizing. Okay? So more, as it depolarizes, it opens more voltage-gated sodium channels. The sodium rushes in, and then the sodium channels close about 1 millisecond after opening. Okay, that's in C. And then the cell begins to repolarize. So the voltage-gated potassium channels open, and the potassium goes out. It's trying to equalize the charge. It takes positive charges out of the axon. It's making the inside more negative again. Okay, the voltage-gated potassium channels remain open, and potassium continues to leave the axon, and that restores the membrane potential. But a lot of times you get where it goes below the 70 millivolts. That's the hyperpolarization. So the cell becomes even more negative than the resting rate. And that becomes important when we start to talk about refractory periods, and we will talk about that in the next section.